It's good to see everyone, and thanks for joining in. Yeah, as Bob mentioned, uh, we uh, we had not necessarily technical difficulties, but we had some situation going on here where he's going to run the show here from his desk, and I'll tell him when to advance the slide to the next one. But as you can see by this opening slide, my intent is to give a 40-year tour through mid to late 19th century baseball, seen through the careers of Georgia Wright and Albert Spalding. I dug up a nice picture of a baseball field from Baseball in Cincinnati by Harry Ellard, and that's sort of the back screen that you'll see against which I lay a number of different slides as we go through the presentation. So, Bob, next. Yeah, I'd just like to thank Bob and Peter and John Popovich, of course, as co-chairs for the opportunity to present this work to you. I did present the majority of this last April at the Fred. As Bob mentioned, I will be presenting again at the Fred this year related to George and Albert, but from a scribe standpoint, where we're going to be talking about their books and journals. So without further ado, let's jump in here. But before we do, George Wright? No, of course it isn't. This is Harry, his brother. But it's sort of interesting. When I first started researching this book, as most people do when they're researching, they go online, look into things a little bit, and I typed in Wright and Ditson, and up popped as the first connection, a Wright and Ditson company that looks like they've either licensed or have purchased the name Wright and Ditson for a sports clothing line. They make T-shirts and they make polo shirts and hats and that type of thing. And it's all under the Wright and Ditson name. And at the bottom of the first page, they started to give a little history. And here's a picture that showed up as, for want of better thoughts, George Wright. Doesn't look like they did their homework. They got the wrong Wright in this case. And it just gives you a little understanding, I think, of how George Wright and really his brother Harry sort of faded into the fabric of baseball, but aren't really well known anymore. And I think this book is going to do a little bit to hopefully rectify that. Bob, if we could go to the next slide. Here is the real George Wright, as we know him, the first professional superstar in baseball. George was so well known in the late 1860s and early 1870s as a baseball player that many people called him the king of baseball. He was a natural athlete, raised in a family that played cricket. His father was a professional and raised his sons that way. George's older brother, Harry, was a star cricketer as well. And they both got into baseball. And I think really decided that was the future for them. Of course, George and Harry were both on the undefeated 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings. You take a look at the type of statistics that went along with George's play, batting over 600, hitting close to 50 home runs on a team that was all professional for the first time ever, openly professional, and undefeated in the course of that season, winning almost 70 games. And you see someone who was at the top of his career, or very close to the top in 1869. When the Cincinnati Red Stockings folded the next year because they lost a couple games and the Cincinnati faithful were no longer willing to pay the exorbitant salaries of $2,000 or more a year for these guys, Harry and George picked up stakes and moved to Boston, where they started a dynasty, the first professional dynasty in baseball history, the Boston Red Stockings. And of course, George was a centerpiece there as well. During the years that he was there in the National Association from 71 to 75, he averaged 350 in batting. He was a shortstop mainly, played second base every once in a while. And as the 70s wore on and his range became a little more limited, he moved more to second base. But he was with the championship teams in Boston, 72 to 75. Then again, in 77 and 78, when Boston was a charter member of the new National League, which had formed in 1876. By the end of 78, George was ready to change venues and challenge himself a little bit. And he went to the Providence Grays, who were looking for a manager who could also play. And George was a player manager, played shortstop, managed the team to a National League title in 1879. So when you take a look at what George did from 1869 to 1879, those 11 years, he won a championship or was part of a championship team 8 of those 11 years. It's a record that's almost untouchable in the 1800s. Of course, the Chicago teams of the 1880s were strong, but not as strong as Boston was. And of course, George going to Providence and picking up a title in Providence, this was the first and only year that George managed. And he did something that no one has ever done then or now, which was in his only year as manager, win a professional league title in baseball. So a lot of things going on for George, but I don't want to leave out that in 1879, he also founded Wright and Ditson. Now, George had been in the sporting goods business for quite some time. In fact, in 1868, he partnered with his brother Harry in New York City to open up a sporting goods store. At that time, 1868, George was playing for the Unions of Morrisania, so what's now part of the Bronx. So he was in New York. Harry was already in Cincinnati, bringing the Cincinnati Red Stockings together. But they opened up a sporting goods store there, and their name alone was a draw in terms of people wanting to buy from sporting stars in baseball like the Wright brothers. Now, when George moved up to Boston, along with Harry, George opened up a sporting goods establishment, not with Harry, but with good friend and first baseman for the Boston Red Stockings, Charlie Gould. Charlie had been with the Cincinnati Red Stockings at first base as well, and came over with Harry and George. And those guys were partners for a couple of years. Charlie moved on, and the situation was one where George wanted to continue his sporting goods operation. He saw that as a future for him after baseball, and he wanted that to continue. And by 1879, he had brought on a industrious clerk named Henry Ditson, who by the end of the year, George made his partner in Wright and Ditson. And by the end of 1879, they were advertising in the Boston newspapers, baseball and cricket goods, gymnasium equipment, a whole host of things to offer to the sporting goods public. By the time George's career was over, he had done so much in baseball and was so well known that it was a cinch that he was going to be elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and he was in 1937. He was 90 years old that year, and he missed out on hearing that he was elected by a few short months. But he knew that that probably was going to happen, that he was going to be elected. But it was unfortunate that he wasn't around to actually celebrate that. Jim O'Rourke, who was a player that was on George's teams in Boston, and then also followed him to the Providence Grays in 1879. And a future Hall of Famer himself said that George Wright really was never had an equal. He was in a class by himself, and that's high praise from someone like Jim O'Rourke, who said that in 1915 after seeing baseball players come and go for over 40 years. So he had a lot of background to be able to compare George to others before he made that statement. So, Bob, let's go to the next. Now, the other superstar, of course, in professional baseball at the time was Albert Spalding. Spalding started out in the Midwest, in Rockford, Illinois, as part of the Forest Cities of Rockford. He was a good pitcher who was developing. And by the time he played Cincinnati, Forest City playing Cincinnati a number of times in 1869 and 70, both Harry and George could see that Albert was coming on strong as a pitcher. When George and Harry moved to Boston, they wanted to bring the best pitcher that they could get to be on the team. And both of them said, Albert's the guy. And he showed that during the time of the National Association. He was the winningest pitcher with a win percentage of almost 800, over 200 wins from 1871 to 1875. It was just a stellar career. He had done all that he probably could do in Boston, short of becoming the manager and owner of the team. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. And there was an opportunity for him, being contacted by William Hulbert out in Chicago, who was in the Chicago White Stockings administration. And Hulbert enticed him to come to Chicago with three other Boston Red Stockings as the pitcher slash manager, another playing manager. And he came out and was a great success there. He won 47 games in 1876 and led the Chicago White Stockings to the first National League title. Now, Hulbert and Spalding had actually concocted to develop the National League and leave the National Association behind, and it collapsed once the National League was formed. And with Spalding leading the White Stockings to a championship, it was a wonderful year in 1876. And like the Wright brothers, in terms of interest in sporting goods, he himself founded a sporting goods company, Spalding and Brothers, with his 19-year-old brother, Walter. These were young guys who were entrepreneurial and saw the opportunity to sell sporting goods into an ever-increasing marketplace. Over the course of the next number of years, Spalding was quite successful. He bought in as a part owner of the White Stockings. He became president when Hulbert passed away in 1882. And he really was the organizational genius for the National League in the latter part of the 1800s. He, in the late 1880s, led a worldwide baseball tour as a promoter extraordinaire for baseball. Spalding wanted to promote the game around the world as America's national game, and he wanted people to see it. And he set up a tour that originally was going to go to Australia and New Zealand, and it ended up going around the world. And we'll talk more about that later. He was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1939. And interesting that he was elected more as an organization man, a baseball organization man and promoter. But Sam Crane, who was a journalist and ball player before that, recognized that Spalding was a great pitcher. He said really that the secret for Spalding was, in an underhand pitching era, to get a back motion of your arm, which was so strong and high in the backswing. When you followed through, you could get tremendous speed on the ball. And that's what he saw with Spalding, that Spalding could throw with power, with speed, and also with pinpoint accuracy. And the combination was just tremendous. So here are our two superstars. And we're going to go through a journey now of 11 different points where they had their paths cross as baseball was developing. So Bob, let's go to the next slide. Here's a picture of the 1869 Forest Cities of Rockford. But in 1867, late in the summer, I call it David Meets Goliath Part 1. The Forest Cities of 1867 met the Washington Nationals of George Wright and company, and they pulled an upset, the likes of which had not been seen and wouldn't be seen for a while. The Forest Cities beat the Washington Nationals 29-23. The Nationals were a team that was touring the Midwest and the West. They were undefeated in their tour. They'd won a number of games, came in undefeated to a tournament outside of Chicago, and they were going to play the Forest Cities before they went on to play the most well-known team in Chicago, which was the Excelsiors. This was sort of to be a warm-up game for the Washington Nationals. And when Forest City beat them, it was a shock. You see our guy, Albert, circled here. In 1869, he towered over most of the players. Average height of a ball player was 5'8", 5'9", and here was Spalding, who was about 6 feet 1 inches tall. You'll see just to the left of Spalding, Bob Addy, who played second base in that game in 1867. And if you go all the way to the left, second one in is a young Ross Barnes, who was an outstanding shortstop, a deadly hitter, and probably Albert's best friend on the team. So here's a team that went out and beat the best that was out there, at least that they had come in contact with, the Washington Nationals. Henry Chadwick, who was a journalist who was on the beat, if you will, following the Washington Nationals in their tour, said that Spalding basically outwitted the Nationals in his stellar pitching performance. So that was the first time that Albert and George met, but it wouldn't be the last. So let's go to the next slide. By 1869 and 1870, the Cincinnati Red Stockings were the talk of baseball. Of course, 1869, they were undefeated. And here's a picture of them on the left. This was taken at Matthew Brady's photography studio in Washington, D.C., while the Red Stockings were on in the midst of their tour in June, their undefeated tour through Eastern baseball at that time. New York, Philadelphia, Washington. Circled is George Wright, but standing left to right, you've got Cal McVeigh, the right fielder, on the extreme left, Charlie Gould, the first baseman, of course, Harry Wright, the manager and center fielder, looks pretty complacent there, folded arms, surveying the situation, and George standing next to him, a little bit full of himself there. He's got his hand behind his back. He's staring at the camera with a stern look, and he's well deserving of being the king of baseball. To his right is Fred Waterman, the third baseman. Now sitting, you'll see from left to right Andy Leonard, the left fielder, Doug Allison, the catcher. There's Asa Brainerd with the mutton chop sideburns, and next to him on the sitting on the right is Charlie Sweezy, the second baseman. When David met Goliath for the second time, this was in 1870. In 1869, the Forest Cities met the Cincinnati team 4 times, and they went down to defeat to Cincinnati each time. And the first 3 times Forest City played Cincinnati in 1870, they lost. but each time the score kept getting closer. And finally, in October, the Forest Cities and Spalding in particular broke through. Spalding pitched a six-hitter, which was not quite a no-hitter back then, but it was pretty close. To hold a team like Cincinnati to six hits was was an amazing feat, even though four of those six were home runs, two of them one by George and one by Harry. They only scored 5 runs total, and Forest City scored 12. So it was a breakthrough win for Spalding, and both Harry and George again took note of the development of Spalding and wanted to make sure that they kept tabs on him. The Rockford paper was ecstatic. A splendid victory. It was nobly earned. It was probably the best game that they had ever played, and that's probably true. So quite a breakthrough for Spalding and his team. Bob, if we could go to the next. 1871, I mentioned Boston formed the Red Stockings with Harry and George and a couple of other Cincinnati Reds who were brought east by the Wright brothers, Cal McVeigh and Charlie Gould. But this was a team of destiny. It was destined to win because of the top shelf players that it had on a continual basis. From 1872 to 75, won 4 consecutive National Association titles. You see the guys I have circled here, of course, Spalding standing and George sitting, but you've got a number of well-known names here. Standing to the extreme left is Cal McVeigh again. There's Spalding and Deacon White, the catcher, next to Spalding on the other side. And standing on the far right is Ross Barnes. Seated are on the extreme left, Jim O'Rourke, and of course a very young Jim O'Rourke at the time. Andy Leonard next to him, George seated under Al. Right in the middle, the center of it all, Harry Wright, the superlative manager. And if you notice, that first picture I showed you of Harry Wright really was a stylized image made based on this picture with the full beard, the full head of hair, and just staring out, satisfied at what he's done. To the right of Harry is George Hall, a substitute player. To the right of him is Harry Schaefer, the third baseman, and then Tommy Beals, a very good friend of George. In fact, such a good friend that George named his first son Beals after Tommy. So here was a team that was really a team of destiny. The problem became that they were too good a team. In fact, there were 5 future All-Stars on the team besides the Wright brothers and Albert. Jim O'Rourke and Deacon White were future All-Stars as well. 5 out of these 11 guys. It was a team that was pretty much unbeatable. By 1875, it won at over an 800 clip. And so, as Chris Devine, the biographer of Harry Wright, basically said, was this became Harry Wright's league, and people were losing interest in coming to see these guys play on a continual basis and win on a continual basis. It was almost a foregone conclusion. So at that time, Spalding said, I need to look for my own team and I need to look for my own challenge. And he moved off with Cal McVeigh and Deacon White and Ross Barnes to the Chicago White Stockings. So if we could go to the next slide. In the midst of that string that was being played by the Boston Red Stockings, a superlative baseball, Harry Wright wanted to realize a dream, and he was able to do it. And his dream was to bring baseball to England. He had been born in England and came over to the U.S. with his family just as a baby, but he wanted to bring what he viewed as the national pastime in the States to England, to show people in England that there's a worthy sport to cricket, and it's called baseball, and we want you to see it, and we want to show some exhibitions of baseball so you can see just how exciting and interesting the sport is. And he brought the rest of the Red Stockings teams in 1874, as well as the Athletics, the Philadelphia Athletics. And they played exhibition baseball across the UK. The Red Stockings won 8 games, Athletics 6. But even as interesting, the U.S. didn't lose a cricket match to the English cricketers that they played, which was a big surprise. Now, maybe it shouldn't have been a big surprise because the English allowed the U.S. to play 18 men on the field, and the English played either 11 or 12. So there was a decided advantage in terms of number of players that the U.S. team had. But when you take those players and you spread them around the cricket pitch, since there is no foul territory per se, you spread these players over a wider range of field, and that dilutes that advantage a little bit. But certainly it was an advantage for the Americans. The other thing was that the U.S. batted in a way that the English cricketers were almost shocked to see, because it wasn't with the decorum and the defensive nature of defending a wicket from the bowler. It was swing for the fences at every bowled pitch. And Spalding and George Wright and Cap Anson from the Athletics connected more often than not, and they scored a ton of runs with the unconventional way that they played cricket, leading to them not losing 7 games that they played. In this game here in a woodcut that was in Harper's Weekly in September, it's actually an August game, and the London Telegraph reported on it, basically saying what you'd expect and what you wouldn't expect. That the English cricketers really were amazed at the way the ball was handled, fielded, and thrown by these American ball players. But you'd expect them to say, but that wouldn't do in cricket. At some of the antics, like the way they swung for the fences in these games of cricket that they played. But it was a successful venture in that many people were exposed to baseball for the first time in England. It was decidedly an unsuccessful venture in terms of monetary compensation. The receipts didn't cover the expenses, and it was a little bit of a surprise to Harry, but nonetheless, he felt great that he was able to bring this sport to his native land. If we could go to the next slide. So in the middle of the 1800s, 1870s, excuse me, 1876, 77, 78, the curveball was starting to be a pitch that more and more of the pitchers were employing. Of course, Candy Cummings invented the pitch, or is given credit for inventing the pitch in the late 1860s. And it was a problem for both Spalding and Wright. Wright couldn't throw it, Spalding couldn't throw it, and Wright had problems hitting it. Spalding basically had talked with Candy Cummings in 1870, 1871, and tried to figure out how to throw the pitch. And try as he might, he couldn't do it. George Wright, when he was faced with the pitch, as pitchers are learning a new pitch and throwing it hard and missing more often than not as they're experimenting with it, batters would get hit. And George just didn't like that. He didn't want to be hit by a pitch. And George Toohey, who was a historian for Boston Red Sox baseball in the 1890s, wrote a book about the Boston Red Stockings of the 70s and 80s. And he mentions in it that Wright really didn't care to get hit with a baseball. George Wright's batting average after 1875, when he averaged 350, from 1871 to 1875, he never hit 300 again. His average steadily decreased. Of course, some of that's attributed to aging, but some of it, at least George Tui's version, attributes some of it to the curveball. And throwing a curve was something that Spalding realized was going to be a problem for him in the future, as the curveball was taking over and he couldn't throw it. So that'll enter into some of his decisions as we go further into the story here. Let's go to the next slide. At the time the curveball was coming into the fore, so were some thoughts related to protecting the players. Of course, we all know that in the 1860s and early 1870s, most players had no protection whatsoever, including the position that was the most dangerous to play, and that was catcher. Now, George Wright, in the late 1860s, had fooled around with developing what he called a catcher's mouth protector. It was really a rubber plate that was put inside the mouth to sort of hold the teeth in place if a catcher got hit with a pitch. George also wore the catcher's mouth protector, but he wasn't a catcher. He wore it out in the field. He wanted to protect something else. He wanted to protect his smile. He was known as Smiling George. And if his smile got destroyed, one of his characteristics that people love so much might go with it. So he popped a catcher's mouth protector in there for his own safety, as well as selling it to some of the other guys. Doug Allison, catcher for the Cincinnati Red Stockings, used a catcher's mouth protector in 1869, and it was sold at auction in the early 1900s. Harry Ellard, whose father was part of the organization, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, and Harry Ellard himself was a writer about baseball. His estate was sold, and in that estate was Doug Allison's catcher's mouth protector, along with a number of other Cincinnati relics. That mouth protector had scars in it from teeth clamping down on that rubber formed plate there in order to try to protect himself as a pitch would come screaming in and he couldn't handle it, or potentially a foul tip came off a batter's bat and he was in trouble. So, excuse me, the catcher's mouth protector was the first of these protected pieces of equipment. By 1877, Fred Thayer, the captain of the Harvard University baseball team in Boston, invented the catcher's mask. Excuse me. And that really was a major step forward in protection for the catcher. George saw right away that this was going to be something that was useful in the marketplace. And he arranged to observe Thayer and the mask. They were both in Boston. He got Thayer to patent it, and George paid him a royalty to control the sales of it. And it was a great move on George's part related to selling equipment into the marketplace. Spalding, who had seen that he couldn't really throw a curveball anymore, decided he was going to take himself out of the pitcher's spot in 1877. He was still managing the Chicago White Stockings. He put himself at first base, but one of the first things he decided was, I get the ball thrown to me an awful lot, and my hand is killing me. I've got to get some protection here. I'm going to wear one of these gloves. Now, a couple of ball players had worn gloves before, but let's not move forward yet. They had worn gloves before, but not with any frequency. And usually they were flesh-colored gloves, so they'd blend in, and people in the stands might not even be able to tell that someone was wearing a glove. Spalding took a different tact. In 1877, he not only wanted to wear a glove, but he chose a jet black color for his glove. Why did he do that? He wanted to fuse his heroic aura of being a star baseball player with someone who was wearing a glove. He wanted to overcome spectators' thoughts that, gloves are for wimps. I'm not going to wear a glove. Spalding proudly wore his glove, and with it, he started sales to increase for gloves. Because if Al Spalding could wear a glove, I guess I can wear a glove. And that type of marketing was something that Spalding was excellent at. Promotion, either for the game or for the sporting equipment business, was something that was right up his alley. So this is a picture on the left-hand side out of the first Spalding's official baseball guide, where he not only had information about the game, but he also advertised equipment. And you can see all three: the catcher's mask, the catcher's mouth protector, the catcher's gloves, all advertised in the 1878 official baseball guide. Bob, let's move forward. Now, these official baseball guides were something that were unique to Spalding. He actually had convinced William Hulbert, who was not only the president of the Chicago White Stockings, but president of the National League. He'd convinced Hulbert to give him, Spalding, the ability to put out what was called an official league book in 1878. It chronicled with statistics individual performance in the 1877 season, as well as performance by the teams themselves. The rules and regulations for the sport were also there, and it was a handy guide to baseball. Spalding ingeniously came up with his official baseball guide to pair with the official league book. There was nothing official about Spalding's official baseball guide. The National League hadn't condoned it, but Spalding took the name nonetheless. No one made a complaint, and on he went. What was great about the official baseball guide was that it not only had statistics, it not only had rules and regulations, but it had tips on how to play baseball, how to hit better. Some of the leading hitters had articles in there: how to throw a curveball, how to run the bases better, how to steal bases. These were tips for people who were learning how to play baseball or how to play it better out in the public. If you were let's say an immigrant who had just come into the United States and you wanted to show your civic pride and your love of country, what better way to do it than to play baseball? Well, first you have to learn how to play baseball. Where could you do that? You'd go to Spalding's official baseball guide, where you could learn how to play baseball, and things like that were important. You'd get someone who could read English if you couldn't, and they'd read it to you, or you'd learn English by reading the baseball guide. It was a multi-purpose promotional device. And of course, at the back of the official baseball guide was what? Spalding's equipment, telling you where you could get it, how much it costs, all the different types of equipments. And people like George Wright, who didn't have a baseball guide in the late 1870s, he was able to advertise his own equipment on a one-page sheet in Spalding's official baseball guide. Al Reach advertised a couple of times in the early 1880s before he started to put out his own official baseball guides for the American Association in 1882, when that was formed. Al Reach got the contract to do that. And in 1884, when the Union Association of Baseball Clubs was formed, George Wright, because he bought into a club in Boston, partial ownership there, the Union Association was more than happy to have him publish a baseball guide for the Union Association. They also gave him sales for baseballs. They had him get the inside track for uniforms for the Union Association. So here by 1884, 3 leagues had 3 different people publishing baseball guides, but no one did it better than Al Spalding and his official baseball guide. Let's move on to the next. By the end of the 1880s, Albert Spalding wanted to do the same thing that Harry Wright had done in the 1870s, but Albert thought on a much bigger scale. Where Harry brought baseball to England, George wanted to bring, or Albert wanted to bring baseball to the world. At first, he had an idea that was to bring baseball to Australia and New Zealand, and he set up logistics and schedule to do that. But as he was setting that up, the idea became a much more grandiose one, and he decided, even before he was going to go to Australia and New Zealand, he decided that he had to make this a larger um, enterprise. He sent someone to explore routes from Australia and New Zealand, to go past India and Ceylon and go through the Suez Canal and up to Europe that way. And he actually set up a worldwide tour to expose the world to the game that he so proudly wanted them to see. He went from San Francisco, which is where the Chicago White Stockings and a group of all-stars named the All-Americas uh, they left from San Francisco and went to Hawaii. It was called the um, Sandwich Islands back then. Went to Hawaii, then New Zealand, Australia, kept going and went up to Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And then from there, through the Suez Canal to Egypt, then into the Mediterranean, Italy, France, ended up in the UK, and showing baseball to the world. Some places, there were mystified crowds of hundreds of people. That was in places like Ceylon and Egypt. Some places, there were crowds of thousands of people, even 10,000 at one game in Australia. The Australians knew about baseball from ships that had come there and people who had brought the game with them, as Hawaii knew about it. So Australia was not unfamiliar with baseball, and they loved seeing it. In fact, they loved it so much that they didn't want to see the Americans play cricket versus their Australian teams, because they knew the Australian teams were better. They wanted to see American baseball, and they got a real good opportunity to do that in Sydney, in Melbourne, and it was a great tour. The crowning jewel, if you will, of this whole tour came when Spalding's World Tour played in London before the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII of England, at the Kennington Oval in London. You see a picture here of the members of the two teams that were going to play that exhibition, and right in the middle on the left is Albert Spalding in his black coat, and next to him on the right of him is George Wright in his bowler hat holding a baseball. To the immediate left of Spalding, standing in his Chicago uniform, towering over Spalding there is Cap Anson. And to the left of left and above Anson is John Montgomery Ward, the captain of the All-Americas. These were the best that America had to offer: the championship Chicago White Stockings, the All-Stars, All-Americas team, playing before the future King of England. And the London branch of the New York Herald wanted to get reactions from people. What do you think of this game, baseball? They passed out some index size cards, like a 3x5 card, and pencils, and they said, write down at the end of the game what your thoughts are of these ball players in this baseball exhibition. And they got a whole range of things. We love baseball. It's a wonderful game. It's just English rounders in another form. In between those two, the Prince of Wales decided he wanted to write down his comments, and this is what he wrote here. And it was a very diplomatic statement about, I saw the game. It was fantastic. I still consider cricket better, but what a great game I've seen. And the idea that he was that diplomatic won Spalding over right away, because Spalding felt that answer basically said, baseball is a worthy sport versus cricket. And that was what he was trying to get across to the world. This is America's sport, and I'm proud of it. The other thing he wanted to do was generate some equipment sales, and he did that too. He laid the groundwork to do that in Australia, where equipment sales developed rather quickly for Spalding goods, and even in England, where some goods were shipped over the next decade or so. So this global baseball tour, even though he did all of that, just like Harry Wright, he didn't make any money at it. His expenses overwhelmed his receipts, but he felt it was a worthwhile venture. Bob, if we could go to the next. The early 1990s, it was time for George Wright to get out of the sporting goods business. George and his partner Harry had done something very special. They not only sold cricket and baseball goods, but they delved into other markets and supported them and helped them grow. The lawn tennis market was one that Wright and Ditson made their own. The golf market was one where George brought over clubs from Scotland and actually developed the first public playing of golf in the Northeast. And here is a picture of a Wright and Ditson polo guide, it was called, in 1885, 86. They put this out to support the sport that had become a craze in the Northeast and the Midwest. It was called roller polo. You see these two players here on roller skates in a roller rink. They're using field hockey type sticks to knock around a bouncing rubber ball and somehow get it into a goal at one end of the rink or the other. You can imagine the visceral excitement of the fans as they saw these guys roller skating at top speed, running into each other, hitting each other with these field hockey sticks as they're trying to get the ball into the goal. It was just mayhem, but the fans loved it. And this sport was a bonanza for Wright and Ditson. They could sell uniforms, they could sell sticks and balls and cages at either end for the goals, and they even resold the roller skates that were manufactured by people in the Midwest and in Boston and in Philadelphia. So this was the type of thing that Wright and Ditson did. They explored new markets and made new markets profitable for themselves because they didn't run up against Spalding at every turn, who had dominated the baseball market. Spalding brothers bought Al Reach's business, sporting goods business, in 1889, and in 1892 bought Wright and Ditson's business from George. And the reason it was from George is Harry had passed away a couple months before. He was only 35 years old, and he died of a massive heart attack. And George realized that Ditson was the inside genius, if you will, moving the business forward. He did the operations, took care of the profits, and George was a salesman supreme. He said, without Ditson, I can't go on. Spalding bought that business, George Wright's business, and then a few years later bought Peck and Snyder, which was ostensibly the world's, North America's biggest sporting goods business in the 1860s and 70s. So in 5 years, Spalding wrapped all these up into a super business that would become an empire. But he really wanted Wright and Ditson's business because they were a new business development type of operation. They had a nose for new business, if you will. Bob, if we can move on. The man and the myth. In 1905, Spalding took his last official action, and that was sponsoring the Mills Commission to definitively determine where were the roots of America's national game. He said, Spalding, that it was in America, and it was by an American that this game was invented and promulgated. Henry Chadwick used to kid him, no, not really. It just evolved from the English child's game of rounders. And Spalding did not want to hear that. And so in 1905, he issued a challenge in his official baseball guide. we're going to find the roots of baseball. He issued it to the public. Send us your information. A fellow named Abner Graves came up with a story that he sent to an Ohio newspaper. And that story basically was the idea that the game itself was invented by a 19-year-old behind a barn out in a field in Cooperstown, New York. This guy named Abner Doubleday sat on the ground and he etched into the dirt a diamond, and he showed everyone where people were going to play. And Graves and Doubleday and others played that afternoon and had a wonderful time. Spalding got a hold of a copy of that letter and he said, "We don't need to search anymore, fellas. This is the smoking gun in terms of who invented baseball, and it proves it's an American sport." And he published such in the official Spalding Guide in 1908. Unfortunately, none of that was true related to the official inventor of baseball. This guy right here, Abner Doubleday, was 19 years old at the time in 1839, but he was at West Point becoming a military officer who would be a hero in the 1861 to 65 conflict that was known as the Civil War. He was a leader of men in Gettysburg and Fredericksburg, and he never once spoke in all his life, in his writings, in talking to anyone about inventing baseball. He was actually in West Point rather than in Cooperstown, and it was supposed to be invented. And oh, by the way, if he was with Abner Graves was 5 years old in 1839. So the 19-year-old Abner Doubleday playing baseball with the 5-year-old Abner Graves didn't really fit the overall picture here. But Spalding was convinced. You see his statement here. He's now convinced that nothing originated from rounders, this asinine pastime. Basically, Spalding, you always knew where you stood with Albert Spalding on any particular issue. And the myth of an American game, yes, that's true, amalgamated from games of bat and ball, but invented by Abner Doubleday, hardly the case. Let's move on. This is the last slide in my presentation here. It's from the inside cover of a book that Spalding wrote in 1911, which became a bestseller and a seminal text on baseball, America's National Game. And he signed this inscription to his good friend, George Wright, "To my old comrade and lifelong friend, George Wright, whose extraordinary skill as a ball player has never been excelled," with the compliments of A.G. Spalding. These guys had known each other for over 40 years, close to 50 years, playing baseball against each other, with each other, getting into the sporting goods business, competing against each other, and then joining forces again. These guys had a friendly rivalry that did as much to promote baseball as anything else in the game from 1867 until the early 1900s. And it's a fitting tribute that Spalding has given George Wright, whose extraordinary skill as a ball player has never been excelled. Basically, king of baseball. And with that, I want to go to a last slide, which just says the book's out as of February 4th. Selling Baseball. It's got a book list starred review. They called it a sneaky good baseball history. They liked it. 30% discount if you order direct from Roman and Littlefield at their website and use the discount code that is here. RLF and F30, all caps. RL, Roman and Littlefield, F and F, friends and family, 30% discount. It's also available from Amazon and Barnes and Noble and the usual suspects. But the last slide basically is thanks for listening. And if there are any questions, maybe we can get to them.
Jeff, thank you very much. There are several comments in the chat. Paul Langendorfer, while you were showing some of the guides that Spalding and Wright had developed, noted that there's a free online resource if anybody wants to take a look inside the Spalding guides, particularly the 19th century. And he puts a catalog link in there, which he picked up from Google search. This is done by the Hathey Trust.
Yes.
They have a number of guides that they have digitized and put online. The largest group of them that I'm aware of is the University of Maryland library. Lots of Spalding guides, lots of Reach guides, and they go into the 20th century, although it gets a little less complete there. They apparently had received Nick Young's library, and they digitized all of those.
Former NL president.
Congress has a number of them digitized, as does several other folks. If you just make an internet search. Jacob Kaufman is anxious to pick up the catcher's glove that looks and the catcher's gear. I have a feeling the delivery is going to be a little more difficult.
Absolutely.
Jack Seltzer comment on while he says, I'm enjoying this quite a bit, thank you, but to defend my hometown, Cincinnati, early in your presentation, you indicated that the Wrights and other Red Stockings went to Boston because Cincinnati lost interest after the Reds lost a game. But it's a more accurate that Boston just paid more and thus stole the Red Stockings. Nothing illegal, of course, but a harbinger of what was to happen in baseball after 1875. Although I think that didn't the owners of Cincinnati move to a non-professional team?
And they ended up doing that. They ended up doing that. But the idea that Boston paid more, Boston was willing to pay top dollar. They wanted to bring both Wright brothers in, and they paid them $2,500 a piece to do it, which was more than anyone else was being paid. And the Cincinnati Red Stockings at the time in 1870 were not about to pay that type of money. They had paid George $1,400 in 1869 and Harry $1,200, and doubling that type of salary by 1871 just wasn't going to be in the cards, I don't believe. So I certainly share that sentiment that Boston might have offered top dollar, but Cincinnati, I don't think, had the wherewithal to compete in that type of marketplace.
There's a comment by Jerry McArenda. Spalding was a player innovator and understood the issues and problems with the early 19th century game. Why did he choose to emulate the robber barons of U.S. industry rather than speak for the players' point of view? By the way, the same goes for a number of early and current owners also.
Absolutely. So my belief is twofold. One, the times of the robber barons were times of immense wealth made by monopolization of an industry. It was happening in steel, it was happening in sugar, it was happening in coal, it was happening all across the U.S. Spalding saw that monopoly was a technique to be able to increase profitability for industry. Remember, monopoly wasn't illegal until 1890, when the Sherman Antitrust Act came into place, but it really wasn't enforced until Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. And Spalding did a great job of obscuring his purchase of Wright and Ditson. He left George Wright as president under the running of Wright and Ditson, seen by the public as a competitor of Spalding. And so he tried to leave a semblance of competitiveness that the public could see, while he consolidated the power as a silent partner and could control pricing, product availability, those types of things. So I think Spalding was had always been a creature of organization. The National League was founded under his auspices with William Hulbert to organize and put power in the hands of the club's organization. Once the clubs divided their duties into the manager and his team, you concentrate on delivering a good product to the customer, and we in the organization side will concentrate on administration and logistics, and oh, by the way, we'll control the purse strings. That's set up in the 1870s, the conflict that really developed and came to a head in 1890 with the Players League, when John Montgomery Ward led the players out to another league because Spalding was not willing to give on that type of point. From the mid 1870s on, he had been an organization man. So I didn't see him as one who would take up the cause of the players at that point in time.
Mike Halpert has a comment on the same point. Spalding was a businessman at heart, and he saw how baseball could be a profitable business if it was run like a business, and he focused on that, apparently.
Sure. Yes.
Well, we have a number of comments congratulating on the talk and stating that they enjoyed it. Jeff, thank you very much. Enjoyed the time to your presentation. It's an interesting set of personalities, Spalding and George Wright, going through this, and we look forward to seeing you at the Fred.
Well,
Peter,
I appreciate it, and your point is well taken. These were two guys who were very different, yet they were friends for 45 years, and rather close in terms of some of the things that they did. So, it was two ways to approach selling baseball into the marketplace, and both were very successful.
all right, very good. Thank you again, Jeff.
Sure.
Peter, if you'd like to give us a close.
Yes, Jeff, thank you very much again. That was a wonderful presentation. Great slides, great images. I wanted to say that if the book, the book is very, very well written, and it really gets into this whole thing about them. They really come to life, and it's really worth the read. I want to also mention that right after this, we sign off here, I will be sending out a 1-week heads up for our next book club discussion, led by Paul Langendorfer here, who's here this evening. So it turns out to be another very interesting 19th century, 19th century baseball set in a novel, and it's been a very entertaining read. And then just want to say that our next 19th century baseball speaker series is by one of our veteran viewers here, that will be the topic. It's by Terry Bound, and the topic is going to be the sad tale of Dapper Dan Lally. So we'll be seeing that on March the 11th. I'll be sending out some notices on that. So thank you very much, you all, for joining us. Look forward to seeing many of you again, and some of you up in Cooperstown, I hope. And thank you again. And thank you again, Jeff, for a nice job. Bob?
Within the next
couple
of weeks, certainly no more than 30 days from now, we will start soliciting for presentations for next year's speaker series. So if you've got something you're interested in, you might want to start developing an abstract.
Yeah, I have that email for tomorrow, actually. So
Okay,
you'll see that notice tomorrow. It'll go out, call it for abstracts for the next 19th century baseball speaker series.
very good.
All right.
Everyone, thank you for coming and look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Nate.